Hello and welcome to an episode of Atomic Vinyl Reviews. My name's Jacob and today we're taking a look at the brand new MonsterArts King Ghidorah 2019 figure from the brand new film Godzilla, King of the Monsters, the first American incarnation of this character actually. So this is the first American Ghidorah design. And yeah, let's get right into it. So first of all, let's start off with the packaging. So if you saw my unboxing of this guy, you would have seen that, yep, this figure's packaging is absolutely massive, as you can see here. Just this huge box that is about as big as an X Plus figures box, but this is a MonsterArts. You can see that we got a cool look at the figure on the front, some nice images on the back, all that good stuff. So we're gonna get rid of this for now. Get to the actual figure. So what do I think about this figure? Overall, I think this figure is somewhat of a mixed bag. It's got some amazing positives, but it's also got a lot of issues that we're going to cover in this review. So let's start off, of course, with the positives. So just bringing him in a little closer. You can see this is a huge figure, and there we go. We can see one of the issues here. He does have issues standing up just because of his sheer size. So one of the best things about this figure is, of course, the massive size of this thing. This is probably, this is definitely the biggest MonsterArts figure I own. Now, I don't have the Biollante figure or any of some of those really massive ones. I do have the previous King Ghidorah figure, so we'll compare them later. But out of the MonsterArts line, this is probably the biggest figure that they've ever put out, and most of that is due to these two massive wings. Now, it gives this figure a real sense of presence on the shelf. He takes up a lot of space, and just the design and the shape of these wings give him like this really engulfing sort of presence. Like whatever figure or other creature you have in front of him, he feels like he's really rising up above and is just sort of dominating that space, and that's really cool. He has a great presence, and overall he looks amazing. So that is the biggest positive about this thing. However, it comes with its, that these wings and its sheer size does come with its own set of issues, and the main one, as you saw there, was this guy has trouble standing up. Because these wings are two separate bits that you kind of have to actually assemble and lock in yourself, because he does come in a few pieces in the box. You have to actually slide on his wings onto little pegs that he has in his shoulders, and you have to put his tails on, which is no big deal. If you've had any MonsterArts figures before, you pretty much know how to insert ball joints, because they come apart every now and again, and that's a thing you have to do. But yeah, that's some of the issues that we'll get into later. The other positive is this guy is in scale with all your other sort of 6-inch figures from the King of the Monsters film. So here we have the NECA Mothra figure, a really cool figure that I unboxed recently. I actually haven't got the video of that uploaded yet. A lot of my videos don't come out in the right order, sorry about that guys, but I will have that up soon. And we got our Godzilla, King of the Monsters, MonsterArts figure. And you can see these guys scale up really nicely with this guy. And unfortunately, we don't have any Rodans in this scale yet. Perhaps some of those Jack-specific figures would scale up nicely. I don't know, because they're bloody not easy to get here where I live. Like, they have them in some select stores in the US, but here in Australia, it's just not worth paying for those things to get them shipped, and with the exponential prices that they're listed for and all that bullshit. But until we get a NECA one or the MonsterArts one, this is all I got to work with for the moment, so we don't have a Rodan to really compare this thing to, except for the Bandai, but it's not really in scale. But yeah, it scales nicely with these two, so you can see they have a really cool sort of variation in sizes. You got the very small Mothra here and this medium-sized Godzilla. You can also, of course, bring in the NECA Godzilla, which scales also perfectly with this one, pretty much. Do I have him in one hand? No, but doesn't matter. You guys know how big that one is. Basically the same size as this guy. So that is a huge benefit of this guy. So he does look really great with your other King of the Monsters figures. And he's the only King Ghidorah that we have in a proper scale with these guys at the moment. In fact, he's the only really sort of high detailed version of this character that you can get at the moment. The only other one that I actually have at present happens to be the Bandai Vinyl, which is pretty much the same size as this Godzilla here, with just the wingspan. So you can see this guy is of a very different size, and this is the only other one that I could get my hands on. Again, the Jack-specific ones I can't really get a hold of, because I don't feel like paying for how much they're going for online, especially for just the sort of basic figures that they are. But here you can see, this is the only other King Ghidorah from that movie that I've got. And you can see the difference in quality and size and just the overall impressiveness when you put the figures together. Sorry, it's a little... There we go. You can kind of get him centered a little bit more just to give you guys a nice idea. So yeah, definitely loving the size of this thing, the wingspan. He just has... You're really drawn to this thing because he just totally, you know, dominates that space. And the sculpt on this guy is really beautiful, and it really stands out nicely. So, I'm just going to get rid of some of our little backdrop decorations, and we can get a proper look at this thing from, you know, a 360-degree view. And don't worry guys, what I'm going to do later on is we're going to zoom in closer and we can see this guy in all his detail. So, you can see, I actually managed to get him to stand up without any of the stands, because a lot of you guys familiar with this thing might be wondering, doesn't this thing usually have stands? Yes, he does. He comes with these things, which are these little plastic stands. They come in pieces. You got this little base piece, and you got a little middle spire of these little plastic clear rods, and they have ball joints on the top, and on that you insert these little pegs, which actually are used to hold the wings. So you get a couple of these. You get 3 of these little bases. So I'll just bring all of those in. So he comes with 2 different lengths of these little rods. He has 2 longer ones and 2 shorter ones, and you can swap those around depending on the length you need. So this one here is the longer one, and that would just clip like this over the wing, and that's how you get him to stand. And same with the shorter one. He also comes with a third little base like this, with this weird little piece that you can slide under his crotch area to help him stand as well if you need that extra support. I haven't really used this one yet because it's kind of tricky to weave this in between his legs and to really get him to sit his weight on it. But you know, you can definitely use these, and I would recommend using these. However, you can actually get him to stand without these in a couple of different ways. The first one, of course, is the one I'm using here, which is you bend his wings back as far as they will go, and that will get his weight to kind of sit backwards a little bit more, because he tends to be a bit top heavy because of his necks and his heads, and of course just the bulk of his wings. But if you bend them back, you just manage to get a center of gravity at the point where he does stand without them. But you can see he is pretty fragile, so I just moved him there, and now he doesn't want to stand anymore. But yeah, you can kind of get him to stand like that. He's just leaning on his tails. I don't recommend this method for long periods of time, actually, because, again, this guy is a pretty heavy figure. These wings are huge, they're solid plastic, and though they are fairly thin, they are still very weighty, and you really don't want this guy falling over, because chances are he will break. But the other way you can get him to stand without using those little stands is you can actually put him in his wing walking pose, as he did in the film, which is a little bit tricky, but I'll just kind of show you guys. So you can see there's the back of the figure. It's got his 2 tails. We'll take a look at that later. But what you need to do is you need to pull his wings off. They just have these little openings here with these sort of hexagonal holes. Are they hexagonal or octagonal? Yeah, hexagonal. And he has these pegs on the side here. And you can see his wings slip into those holes at the side, and then you can kind of articulate them. He actually has a pretty good range of motion with these wings. Nothing spectacular, but they do move forward and back. And they don't have any gaps or anything when the wing is in like this, for the most part. So they do look really good. However, it is somewhat redundant, this range of motion, because a lot of the time, you know, again, you get issues when you do move these wings around, and it's always a little bit of an ordeal when dealing with them. But I'll go into that a bit later, because we're going to put him in his other pose. So this particular wing holds on a lot better, I find, so it's harder to pull out. Because this other wing, the first one that I pulled off, actually has issues where it tends to slip out a lot. So it really tends to kind of fall out. I need to kind of do something about that perhaps in future. But what we got in here is we got this little floaty section here that's over the shoulder that helps cover the wing bit up, and then this bit is like on a ball joint here. And they're fairly firm and they do their job well. However, once you get the wing in, up and down, there isn't any real motion for it to move up and down, so it's kind of redundant to have this bit on a ball joint at this section, because there's another one deeper in the wing anyway, but whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to just twist the wings so they're facing sort of more sideways, and then we kind of try and find a spot that they'll lock in. And there we go. And then you can just simply put him down like that with his wings sideways. And now you've got him in his nice wing walker pose. And we'll just do the same with the other wing. This one might be a little trickier, because again, it's a lot firmer to push in. And there we go. So indeed you can actually just get him to stay in this pose, and this one has its downsides, but the upside is, of course, it's much more stable. He's not going to fall over like this. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this look for King Ghidorah. I was actually, before the movie came out, I was really hoping they wouldn't have him walking around on his wings, because I feel that's such a generic dragon-y thing to do, and to see King Ghidorah doing that, I was like a bit hesitant. But I really, really liked this character in the film. I think they just knocked him out of the park, that even when, you know, he did stuff like that I would have on paper not liked, I didn't mind at all. I was very forgiving towards this character because they just made him so awesome in the film. So, you know, this is one option for you guys. Of course, the downside of this is that these wings are solid bits of plastic, so when you go around the back, this doesn't look right at all, because these bits are meant to be around his waist. These little other sort of parts of his wings are meant to be down near the side down here, but instead they kind of just move up. However, from the front, if you ignore that, it still, you know, looks good for those sort of poses. You can get away with it with at some angles, and you can take photos of him like that for, you know, whatever, toy photography or whatever, if you want to do that. So that's always a good option. So we'll just remove these. He actually stands pretty well without his wings, all things considered. He's built pretty, like, this whole segment of him is built pretty well, like a good MonsterArts should be. He actually balances pretty nicely, even with his, as you can see here, his tails are just floating in the air here. They're not touching the table or anything. Even though he's very top-heavy because of these heads, he still balances nicely. So the main issue with his balancing is, of course, these massive, massive wings. So these are solid, hard plastic, kind of very similar to the original Ghidorah wings, as you can kind of hear as I'm tapping on them. And they're very big. In fact, I think they measure about 30 centimeters in length, so, you know, the height of... If you have this wing like this tall, it's like the height of a 30 centimeter tall X Plus figure, which is massive. And just to have two of these things on either side of a MonsterArts is really crazy. So that's one of the issues. Another issue, and I'm just going to get rid of the wings for a second, just to kind of help demonstrate this, is that some of these ball joints on them, they do tend to fall off a little bit. He has pretty good articulation all round, you know, ignoring the wings here, but his necks and his tails, they actually have really firm ball joints, and you can get a lot of motion out of these things. Like, you can do pretty much whatever you want with these necks here. You know, they can turn all the way back like that. You can get them to look you know, he can like look at his crotch there. He can do all sorts of weird things. So you can wrap his necks around other figures if you want to, like you've seen probably seen people do in different displays. And these are really cool, and I really like the articulation on these necks. The MonsterArts did really great with that. However, he does have issues when it comes to joints popping off, as do most MonsterArts figures, but him in particular, especially when he's got the wings on and you're trying to change the poses, it makes it really fiddly, and it tends to, for some reason, it tends to pop off on mine. So we got Kevin here. There's SH MonsterArts Kevin for you guys, and you know in the film when his head gets cut off, that's approximately where I have the biggest issues with his necks popping off. About this joint, I think. It is actually not popping off now, which is really funny, but if you see my unboxing video, the moment I touch this guy, the first thing that happens is his neck pops off here. And for some reason it doesn't want to come off now, but every other time that I touch this guy, it always pops off there. That's something to bear in mind. Also, when it comes to articulation, his jaws don't open very far, which is a little bit sad. They only open about this much. However, if you've seen the film, when this guy roars, his jaws open very wide. They have almost like a 90-degree angle to them when he's roaring. But already here you can see another huge issue with the articulation, and that is with the tails. These things really like to pop off. It's very difficult to pop them, yeah, to have them not falling apart. So these ones, the tails, are actually very well articulated as well. They also have very firm ball joints, and they bend quite far, side to side, and that's really good, but they also don't happen to have very strong ball joints, because they do tend to fall off a lot. Especially when you're trying to get him, see? Especially when you're trying to get these tails angled up a little bit, because when you have him standing, you want these tails moving up a little bit, so you can kind of lean him back a little bit, so his wings can balance better. And the moment you do that, they always pop off. So they can move side to side very well. Like, you can get them to, you know, do really nice round curves, and they look flawless. But you can't really get them to move up this way at all. They always have to be angled down a little bit, and that kind of gets in the way somewhat. Again, you know, for you guys familiar with MonsterArts, you know that this thing is just chock full of ball joints. Like, every little segment that goes down here is a different ball jointed section all down the necks. So we get a lot of movable parts on this guy. And same with the legs here. You can get a little, like, these are fairly stiff legs, and I understand why, because for the most part, you're not going to be doing much with these, because they're going to be holding the figure up. Unless you want, you can kind of get him into like a flight pose, where his legs are kind of bent back a little bit, if that's what you're after. And that would be a really cool way to pose this figure. But for the most part, these legs don't really do all that much. They kind of just wobble around like this. So that's about the articulation you get on the legs here. And the reason for that is, of course, you have to hold this massive figure on these two little legs. And that is quite an ordeal. But somehow it does work. So, you know, congratulations to them for, you know, making it work, even though it's not quite perfect, but it does the job. So let's get to the sculpt on this guy. The sculpt and the paintwork, because just like everything else, mixed opinions on that as well. Alright guys, so now we can take a nice close look at King Ghidorah's detailing here. So I have removed one of his wings just because the way I'm doing this is obviously I'm holding him freehand here so I can move him around and show you guys all the various close-up details. The way I did this before, because I actually tried recording this review once before, I wasn't really happy with the results, so I'm doing this a second time just so you guys get a much better review out of it. And the first time I tried moving the camera around, however that had a lot of shaky cam elements which I wasn't really very happy with. But yeah, let's start off with his faces, because that is sort of the focal point of this figure. As you can see here, he has nice, fairly sharp detailing on his faces. You can see he's got nicely painted in eyes. They got that sort of white area at the back, and yellow pupils, or irises and black pupils actually. But you see, so they did that pretty nicely. I think they overall, the faces are pretty close. However, I do actually have some issues with them. I think the sculpt, like I said, and just the actual figure is really nice as a figure itself. However, accuracy-wise, they're not quite there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut away now, and I'm going to show you guys a comparison photo of this guy and the actual King Ghidorah from the film, and pay close attention to his nose. I think you'll find comparing this guy's nose, you can see they have like this little tiny nose holes quite far apart on his face, kind of to the side. However, in the actual film, his nose was far more like an Eastern dragon, where his nose holes are a little bit bigger, closer together, and higher up on the tip of his snout. So I'll cut away now and kind of show you guys that. I actually find it really odd that they did that on this figure, because the Godzilla that they put out in this line, the Godzilla 2019 MonsterArts, is actually extremely accurate. So to see this guy have these sort of little inaccuracies is a bit odd. Also, if you pay close attention to his horns, in the film, it looked as if the middle head, you see how these have these rounded horns around the middle head? Each head is actually the exact same head. If you look at this figure, down to even the tongue being in exactly the same position in each head, so each face is identical. However, in the film, I think the horns were slightly different on each head. The middle head had these sort of slightly rounded horns at the top. Kevin here had more straight horns, and this guy had sort of in between, where they're a little bit rounded but still a little more straight than the middle heads. And it's a little sad that they didn't go that extra mile to kind of give each face different personalities, maybe make the tongue also go in a different direction on each face. And continuing with the horns, I think the horns are actually a bit thicker and a little bit more broad-shaped than they were in the film. I think they're a little bit smaller and thinner looking in the film, from what I saw. So something about these faces, just in general, doesn't seem accurate to me. I really prefer the version that they used in the film. But they still look really cool though, and they are somewhat somewhat close to what they did look like in the film. If we look at the tongue, like I was saying, I really wish they gave them all an individual sculpted tongue. However, I do like it how the tongues are still kind of not even, how they're not centered in the mouth, they're actually going off to the side. But yeah, it would have been really cool if they actually varied the position of them, because it is kind of very evident that these are all the same face, just cast 3 different times, which is a little bit lazy on MonsterArt's part, because they are known for, even when they like make a new figure that's like a different version of an older figure, they always redo the entire thing. Such as the 2014 figure, they completely resculpted every single part to make the 2019 Godzilla figure. So that's just an interesting little point here. Other than that, I do really like the sculpt on these, just for what it is. Most of the other elements are fairly accurate. If you just look around them, they are nicely detailed. The detailing is quite crisp, and the paint on them is pretty nice. They do have a really odd sort of pink inner mouth, like the actual fleshy tone of the inside of the mouths, as well as the color of the tongues, is this really bright pink. The tongue and the inside of the mouth are actually a slightly different shade of this pink. And I don't know why it's that bright. It does look good, I actually think. I don't have a problem with it. I just think it's really odd, though, because it doesn't really fit the tone of the movie. Because whenever he opened his mouth, it did look a fair bit darker in the film. However, I think they did do a really nice job of the the teeth on this figure. They are have a nice sharp sculpt and are painted really well. So that is a good point there. And yeah, they have this nice sort of spiny detail up the top of the mouth, and I do like the texturing on the spines. So going down his necks here, I think these necks, like I said, are really well articulated. However, you start to see one of the main issues of this figure, and that is the paintwork. So the sculpt on these necks are really nice. I think some areas aren't as crisp as they could be though, but overall I really like the scaling and the sculpt on these things. Especially if we turn them around here, we can see a little bit more of those really nice scales along the back. However, this is all done completely in this very flat beige sort of tan brown color, as opposed to an actual goldish paint or something with some color variance. Because you see, aside from this sort of dark stripe going down the back, this entire figure along the back of it, including the wings, is entirely done in this flat beige color, which is such a shame. So much potential here. You could either go over this thing in like a wash of dark paint, like a black paint if you thin it out, and that would wash into all the little crevices, would really help to bring out these scales. Or if you used, for example, a really lighter colored, sort of slightly metallic gold, dry brushed over these scales, it would have a similar effect, and also just bring so much depth to this sculpt. Because aside from just these little areas of gray, for example here around the middle of the body, there's really nothing going on color-wise, which is such a shame. Because just knowing MonsterArts, they've done such great paintwork in the past. And it just really leaves this figure feeling a little bit lazy in that department. But yeah, going further with the sculpt, you see you get these nice scaling that goes down further down the body. Here there's again a weird transition of the paint where this shoulder part is painted that lighter sort of tan color, and here it goes into a darker brown shading on the wing. And that's a little bit of an odd choice there. They should have kind of had that fade over a little bit. The front of the wings, I feel, is actually painted a lot better, if you can see it there. They got these nice sort of streaks of a darker sort of airbrush that they did across the bony parts of his wings here. And the sculpt work on the membrane of these wings, I think, is really nice. It looks very sort of organic, and especially when you got some nice shadows going over it, it does look very convincing as like an actual skin membrane. However, I would have actually liked it if they did go in and do some really fine work painting in some light veins and stuff like that. They did a similar effect with veins on the Heisei Rodin figure that they did put out a couple of years back, and that was so subtle, but it was really nice. And if they did some very subtle ones here, it would have brought out some more much needed detail to this figure. And especially considering that the back of these wings are completely plain, that would have made a huge amount of difference. While I do really like the sculpt of the membrane on these wings, I feel the scaling on the more bony parts is a little bit of a weak point on this figure. I think they could have done a bit better. They look a little rough and messy, and the edges where the membrane starts and the scaling ends are a little bit of a mushy area. They don't have like a sharp transition between these bony bits and this sort of flat membrane. They kind of just, they fade off into the membrane a little bit, and that looks a little bit cheap for MonsterArts, I will admit. If we come around here, put sort of a nice leathery pattern on this part of the wings, which I do like. That does look pretty cool. But here again, we have some of the more mushy looking scaling parts. And here's these nice sort of little claws on the edges of his wings. There is sort of, you can see seam lines down the edges of these, which is a bit of a shame. They didn't clean those up quite perfectly. But I do really like the scales that he has just here on the sides of his chest. They are done pretty nicely there. And I do like the armor plating that he has going down his body. But again, it does look very flat because of the lack of additional paintwork. Again, just a little wash or a dry brush to bring out some of the highlights would have made all the difference here. Moving down, he has really nice texturing down his legs here. He's got a little bit of paint on his knees, which is good to see, and his claws actually do have a bit of highlighting on them, which is good to see. And they are nicely detailed, even the undersides of his feet are done pretty well here. And we go down towards the tails. The tails have a really cool sculpt there. They have a lot less scaling on them. They have more of a smooth texture, but you can see they have this sort of more organic, sort of leathery type skin texture, and they do have some subtle detailing in there, which is especially visible in this sort of lighting. And you can see he even has these sort of little barbed spikes down the side of his legs, which are really cool. And again, if they'd have gone in over those with some highlights to really make them look like little bit bony shard pieces that are sticking out, that would have made all the difference in giving these things just a bit more, just a bit more presence. However, in, you know, nice shading, nice lighting, this figure really does begin to pop, because all those details that aren't, you know, painted do start to pop out a little better, so you can see all of that there. But yeah, we go to the tails. He does have nice sort of jagged texturing at the top of the tails, little bits of sort of spikes coming out. They're very smooth, and the articulation is built in nicely. So even though he does have little segments, they do look cohesive as one sort of smooth tail, which is really cool. And I really like the design of these barbed tips that he has on his tail. I like the way they kind of get really scaly. And I really, really liked in the film how he shook them and they rattled like a rattlesnake. That was a really cool effect and a nice touch from the movie. But here, again, look at that. There's no paintwork at all on these things. These are just bland, beige, colored, almost skin tone sort of things. Like, this was a perfect opportunity where they could have gone in and painted these spikes in a different color. I don't know why they didn't. Instead, it just comes across as a little bit lazy. I do like how these pieces are not symmetric, how you have these sort of bigger spikes at the bottom and smaller ones at the top. They're very similar to the Heisei King Ghidorah in design, but his tail tips in design, but they just look a little bit different, and it's really cool. And I actually really like the two tails back here, even though they do have a couple of issues when it comes to ball joints popping off and stuff like that. And they are kind of shorter than you'd expect for the tails on this thing to be, actually. And going back to the necks in the back here, I really like the spines that he has running down his back and his head and his necks here. I love how he has the twin rows of spines running down the middle head and just the one on either other heads here. So that is a cool little effect, and I love this sort of the way they change the design up a little bit, and they're done really well in this figure. They're nice and sharply done. Again, we could have used a little bit of highlights on those to help bring those out. And yeah, there's just a nice look at the figure all around. So what else to say? A lot of people, I've seen a lot of people do repaints of this guy where they did paint him in a gold color, and those do look a lot better. I'm actually not that big a fan of repainting MonsterArts figures. I generally kind of like to keep them stock as to how they are, and a lot of the times I find that when people repaint them, they're generally not as cleanly done. Sometimes people do good, but just generally my preference is to keep them how they are. However, most of the repaints I've seen of this guy have actually been a lot better than the stock paint he comes with, because it does look a little bit unfinished, which is probably my main downside to this figure, or one of them, aside from a couple of things we'll get to in a moment after we kind of back the camera off later on. But that said, the fact that they didn't use any gold on this figure doesn't bother me that much, because in the film he didn't look very gold at all. Some of the close-ups of him did, when he had his face, some close-ups of his face around the stadium in Boston, when he was attacking Millie Bobby Brown's character there, looking through the window, there was some gold sheen to him. However, in general, from all the wide shots, he did look about this sort of sandy beige color. So I think that is fairly accurate. However, I do actually really like the look of this guy in a gold color, and some of the, finer details that people have been able to do, by varying up some of the paintwork, did make this guy look so much better than the figure that we did get in the box here. So that is a bit of a downside. And, those inaccuracies, like the faces, do kind of bug me, because I really did like the expressions and the faces he had in the film. In fact, when I first did a video about the reveal of these MonsterArts figures back before we even saw footage of him from the film, I wasn't overly a fan of this guy's design. I thought his design looked a bit generic. And just the personality and the look he had in the film was so much better than what we got here in terms of these figures. That said, though, this is still a MonsterArts figure, and overall, the scaling and the texturing and the design and the build of this thing is really nice. The detailing is pretty damn good, and this is definitely the best detailed King Ghidorah figure that we have got of this design to date. So fingers crossed we get something even cooler in future. But for what it is pretty cool though. So yeah, that's about it for the really close-up details. Let's cut away and I'll cover some more aspects of this thing. Boop, Kevin. So I hope you liked that really close and personal look with at the detailing on this guy. As you can see, kind of a mixed bag, especially when it comes to the paintwork on this thing. And it's definitely the most evident on the back of the wings here. Just a very flat beige kind of color, and I really wish, even though, this is fairly movie accurate, like it comes across as a bit lazy for MonsterArts. I mean, come on. Seriously, guys, I've seen what you can do paint-wise. You can do better. Um, but another issue that I really wanted to touch on, and, after, closer look at this thing, it has really become apparent. So, just like I mentioned with the faces being a little bit off, um, just the size of the heads and the necks is also really off about this guy. So if you did, if you have been seeing, images of this thing and thinking, you know what, it looks like him, but something's not quite right, then yeah, you'd be very correct, because his heads and his necks are actually much bigger than they did appear in the film. If you guys recall, in the film, all the shots of Godzilla and King Ghidorah together, especially when you had close-up of their faces, they were about the same size. Especially when you're seeing the scale of how big his wings are and how big his necks and his heads appear, you can see that his necks and his heads appear much smaller than they do on this figure in compared to his wings. And his wings are pretty accurately sized, I think, especially when you bring in Godzilla here. They're pretty accurate to how they were in the film. So I really think that that is one of the main issues with this guy, and I don't know why they did that, but who knows? Anyway, here is the screenshots. His necks are a bit big and a bit thick, but I think if you just made the head smaller and the necks maybe just a little bit slimmer, that would have made all the difference. Especially the horns on his heads, I think they seem a little bit thicker than they did in the film. So I'm not sure if they were working from like an older version of this King Ghidorah, because like an older sort of when they were making the film, like an original sort of version early on that they were planning to use, and then they tweaked it. But there are some inaccuracies, which is really odd considering that they made their Godzilla from the film absolutely spot on, as opposed to this Ghidorah. So they should have scaled up really perfectly, but there are some little issues like that just make it a little bit off. However, sculpt-wise and, detail-wise, this is still the most accurate and the best Ghidorah we've got on the market currently, until, X Plus releases some unattainably expensive figure that I'll probably never be able to own. Then this thing will still remain the best figure we've got of him. Now, if NECA, those bastards, would get off their asses and just make the damn King Ghidorah figure that they said they're not going to, then that would make everyone happy. Now, they've been saying that nobody's gonna buy a figure that big or expensive. I think that's absolutely ridiculous, and they have more than enough experience making very massive figures like the Alien Queen or their entire quarter scale line of figures, really massive, expensive figures that NECA have been putting out, and people have been bloody loving them. NECA have been shown to have done a great job of those things, and I think they could pull off a really, really top-notch MonsterVerse King Ghidorah. I don't know. Fingers crossed it happens one day. But anyway, let's get to one of my favorite parts of these reviews, and hopefully yours too. That is the size comparison. So Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed that size comparison there. As you can see, this guy is a big boy. Oh man. Especially just as a MonsterArts figure, because, you know, even without his wings, which is, you know, the bulk of his size, like, I mean, literally, it's like putting two giant X Plus figures either side of this thing and using them as wings. I mean, obviously they've been flattened and aren't quite as bulky, but just lengthwise, they are as big as the height of X Plus figures, pretty much. And even just the height of his main body, like, this guy is imposing on the shelf. He has such great presence. So yeah, that is, you know, both a real positive, and like I said earlier, it's where a lot of the downsides of this guy come from, unfortunately. So we'll just kind of get that out of the way, more out of the way so we can fit. But yeah. So to conclude, I don't know what to say about this thing, because he's such a mixed bag. Like, on the one hand, I really love this thing. I don't regret getting him at all. Absolutely not. I really am happy to have this thing in my collection. He's such a great centerpiece to my King of the Monsters figures. And he's the best we've got in terms of a King Ghidorah figure in this scale. Because, I mean, look, what else are you going to use to go with your MonsterArts Godzilla or your NECA Godzilla as a King Ghidorah? Are you gonna use this thing? I mean, this thing's pretty cool, but seriously? Fuck no, no. This is all we got at the moment, and it's, you know, it's still detailed beautifully. It's still a really nice sculpt, and it just looks amazing. Like, it's got such presence, and it's very grand. It's just, you know, it's gonna be a centerpiece kind of a figure. However, yes, as far as MonsterArts figures goes, there's so much to complain about. There's so much to nitpick in here. There's just things that you look at and you go, why did you do that? Why didn't you add a little bit of a metallic sheen to him? Why did you make the inside of his mouth bright pink? That actually doesn't bother me. I actually think it looks pretty good. But, you know, it is a bit odd. Why did you make the necks and the heads too big? Why did you have issues with the nose? Why couldn't you have figured out a better way of doing the wings, potentially? Like, I don't know, I know these kind of wings are more in MonsterArts style, but I'm sure they could have done something really cool if they put, like, some time and effort into perhaps even figuring out a way of making, like, these actual wing membranes out of, like, a thin plastic rubberized material and having articulated sort of fingers throughout. Like, it's tricky. It would definitely be a bit of an ordeal, but knowing MonsterArts, they could do it. They're really good at innovating figure technology and just getting really cool articulation in there. So I think they could have done that. Also, you could complain about the stands and stuff like that, and, you know, this ball joints popping off and all this sort of stuff. And definitely the paintwork feels a bit lazy in some parts. So there is a lot to complain about this thing. It's not a perfect figure, far from it. But as a figure itself, as an object, I'm drawn to this thing, and I absolutely love this thing. So I'm still gonna give it a solid recommend, especially seeing as we don't have anything better on the market at the moment. At least until, you know, X Plus puts out an absolutely inaffordable figure that I'll probably never be able to own of this design. Until then, this is going to be the best we got. But, you know, fingers crossed that we get a brand like Banpresto to put out a solid sort of vinyl of this thing. Because if you guys have been following, Banpresto have been putting out a couple of really cool Godzilla figures recently. There's been the Shin Godzilla figure, which probably the first Shin Godzilla figure that we actually saw photos of back before that film came out, and that figure I love, as well as the Banpresto anime Godzilla figure that they put out, both of which were sculpted by Yuji Sakai. So I'd bloody well love to see a King Ghidorah done in that line, which would scale up pretty much the same as this one, I'd imagine. And, you know, it would be good to have another figure to scale up with our 6-inch Godzilla figures from King of the Monsters, because NECA doesn't want to do it. But for now, this is all we got, and for what it is, I really love it. It does have issues, but it's still a great figure. And that's where I'm going to leave it at. It's up to you people. I just present this figure as is and give you my opinions. I've seen a lot of, like I said earlier, there's been a lot of great repaints of this thing. Now, I personally would never repaint a figure this expensive, even though I know I would do a good job. It's just, I'm sort of, when I come to MonsterArts figures, I come at it as a collector. I'm a bit of a completionist. I want to get as many of them as I can, and I want them to be in as original a condition as I can. So even though I could make them better with paint like here, I really don't want to touch them. If I want to do that, I'll either do my own custom sculpt or get a kit or something eventually. We'll see. But that's it for the review part of this video. I really hope you liked and enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of this figure in the comments below. I've got some really interesting comments on my unboxing video. That video was actually a lot more popular than I was expecting. So I'm hoping you guys also would enjoy this video, where I actually kind of got a lot more better close-ups of this thing, and just a better video in general than that unboxing, hopefully. And with that, may all your vinyl be a radiated vinyl. Over and out.